Our journey begins amongst the hills and medieval ruins of the Palatinate Forest. Crossing the vast vineyards of the Rhine Valley takes us to Karlsruhe, the city planned around its grand palace. After a detour to Bruchsal, we head to bustling Stuttgart, home of Mercedes-Benz. From there, it's east to the walled city of Nordlingen. Then through the countryside to the enchanted Bavarian town of Rottenburg ob der Tauber. Following the popular tourist trail known as the Romantic Road takes us to Würzburg and its famous palace. East along the banks of the River Main is a magnificent city that's the last stop on our route, the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bamberg. Straddling the border with France in southwest Germany is where we find the Palatinate Forest, home to low-lying mountains and swathes of pine and chestnut trees. More than 100 medieval castles and ruins still cling to imposing sandstone peaks and cliffs. Beyond the trees, just past the Hart Mountains, the rolling hills give way to the Rhineland. This region is Germany's second largest producer of wine, and here Riesling is king. The Romans realized grapes could be planted in this area, but it was the medieval monks who established the region's finest vineyards. Today, German vintners carry on centuries-old traditions to produce some of the finest wines in the world. Their heritage lies in 85 kilometers of ancient vine-clad fields whose roots reach east to cross the Rhine River. It's where we find the city of Karlsruhe and its striking palace and gardens. It was originally built for the Margrave Karl Wilhelm in 1715. He ordered the clearing of a large swathe of the northern edge of the Black Forest in order to build his summer residence. But as it went, its construction also marked the birth of a new city. 32 streets and avenues radiate out from the palace tower like the ribs of a fan. Allied bombing in 1944 destroyed the palace and narrowly missed the Queen of Sweden, who was sleeping in one of the resident wings. It was quickly rebuilt and today houses a museum and part of the Federal Constitutional Court. En route to our next stop is the picture postcard countryside where asparagus thrives in the fine sand of the Rhine plain. Germany is Europe's biggest producer of the prized vegetable. We come to Bruchsal and its 18th century palace, lauded for its grand courtyard and marble dome. It was the creation of the architect Balthasar Neumann, considered to be the foremost master of the late Baroque style. He had a hand in most of the major building projects in this region, including more than a dozen churches. The palace complex boasts over 50 individual buildings, and while the foundation stone was laid in 1720, it would be several decades before construction was completed. Today, Bruchsal Palace stands not only as a stunning illustration of Baroque architecture, but also a study of meticulous and historically accurate reconstruction work that wasn't completed until well into the 1970s. Travelling southeast to the outskirts of Stuttgart, we find another gem, but one with humble beginnings. Once a hunting lodge, Ludwigsburg Palace was converted to a residence for a duke and his mistress to become one of Germany's premier palaces. Referred to as the Swabian Versailles, it was amongst the largest buildings in Europe in the mid-18th century. The palatial complex consists of 18 buildings with 452 rooms, surrounded by a park landscape. A 5-minute walk from the palace brings you to a small summer residence and hunting lodge called The Favourite, which provides sweeping views of the grounds. The main courtyard is as big as a city plaza with elaborate Baroque manicured gardens, and it's these that steal the show. Thousands of tulips and roses compete for attention alongside fruit trees and Japanese bonsai plants. Another popular stop is the fairy tale garden that delights people of all ages. It features Rapunzel's tower and other icons from Grimm's fairy tales. One palace resident, Duke Eberhard Ludwig, is credited with the planning of the gardens, but they often changed as the royals came and went. At one point they were even converted to orchards. Finally, in the 20th century, the grounds were returned to their former glory, and in 1953 they were opened to the public. It's easy to see why they attract thousands of visitors every year. We leave the tranquility of the palace garden and travel south to the bustling state capital of Stuttgart. Often called Germany's biggest small town, it transformed itself from a pastoral oasis to one of the country's leading industrial centres. It's also jokingly known as the town that cars built. Not only are Mercedes, Maybach and their parent company Daimler based here, it's also the corporate home of Porsche. And yet, Stuttgart is a city of contrasts. Its industries are nestled within a picturesque valley of leafy hillsides and parklands. It boasts an abundance of arts and culture. It's home to the International Bach Academy, as well as top-ranked ballet. And of course, there's the ever-present outdoor swimming pool, a common sight in many German cities. No trip to Stuttgart would be complete without a visit to the Old Castle. Standing in the very center of the city, it dates back to the 10th century, when Stuttgart was a small settlement for breeding horses. This place started out as a fortress, protecting the stud garden, from which Stuttgart gets its name. In the 16th century, the original keep was converted into a Renaissance palace, with a grand courtyard where royal ceremonies took place. Today, the castle is the home of the Württemberg State Museum, which displays antiquities from the time when the fortress was founded. Another Stuttgart attraction is the famous Double House. Built in 1927, it was a combined effort of 17 avant-garde architects, among them the famed Le Corbusier. Standing on almost absurdly thin columns, it was constructed as part of an international building exhibition. Le Corbusier believed a home should function as a machine for living, and intended the double house to be much like a car, popular, standardized, and mass-produced. It wouldn't be surprising if the great architect's inspiration from cars sprang from here, just on the other side of town. This is the renowned Mercedes-Benz Works. The company dates back to Carl Benz's invention of the horseless carriage in 1885. And while they now operate factories all over the globe, their headquarters remain here in Stuttgart. Its gleaming multi-story museum draws more than 800,000 visitors each year, who come to view an extensive collection of antique and modern vehicles. The official motto of Mercedes-Benz is, "The best or nothing." These cars are certainly among the finest in the world. But with a price tag of around $90,000 for a top-of-the-range S-Class, many of us might have to settle with the latter. But we can still enjoy the museum, where admission is free. But car manufacturing isn't the only industry the city is known for. Just on the outskirts is the town of Weinstadt. Set among 610 hectares of vineyards, it's referred to by some as the Tuscany of Germany. The name Weinstadt literally translates as Wine City. Tending the land is the Rems Valley Winery, a cooperative owned by some 1,500 local growers. It's the 10th largest in Germany. This region's signature grape is the Trollinger, which makes red wines that are light in both colour and taste and are grown almost exclusively in this particular area of Germany. Here we pass the Ipf, a barely wooded mountain crowned by the traces of a prehistoric hill fort. Nearby and overlooking the town of Bopfingen is another relic of the past, the medieval ruins of Castle Flockburg. Once the home of Swabian nobles, all that remains today are the ghostly remnants of the ancient walls. We travel east into the Bavarian countryside and the medieval walled town of Nordlingen. It's a place where old traditions die hard. Every half hour between 10 p.m. and midnight, a sentry climbs an old tower and calls out "All's well" across the ancient city. Nordlingen is built on the site of an unusual depression, which geologists believe was caused by a half-kilometre wide meteorite that fell to Earth 15 million years ago. The old walls seem to perfectly trace the circle of the surrounding crater hills. One extraordinary legacy of the impact is that each of the original stone buildings in the town contains millions of diamonds. Alas, for potential prospectors, they're all less than 0.2 millimeters in diameter. It's believed some 72,000 tons of the tiny gems were formed when the meteor collided with a local graphite deposit. Today, Nordlingen remains one of only 3 medieval German towns with a fully intact surrounding wall. Making our way north, we approach Schillingfürst Castle. Rising high above the town and situated on a rocky outcrop, this massive Baroque structure can be seen for miles around. Though almost certainly apocryphal, local tales tell of the prince who built the castle being left with only a single shilling after paying for the opulent palace. And thus it was named Schillingfürst. The present structure is a successor to several fortified castles that have dominated the spot since the 11th century. It was also rebuilt no less than 3 times after being destroyed. Today it stands proudly intact, and though still in private hands, it's open to the public for guided tours. Visitors who come between March and October can also watch falconry displays held in the castle's English-style courtyard. We continue north to possibly one of the most picturesque towns on this journey, where 1,000 years of history is packed into its cobblestones, Rothenburg ob der Tauber. It's a maze of winding streets filled with crooked half-timbered buildings that look as if they've been snatched out of a fairy tale. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, Rothenburg was Germany's largest city. It intersected 2 prosperous trade routes, Prague to Paris and Hamburg to Venice. But it was to undergo a violent turn in its fortunes in the 1600s during the 30 Years' War. The Catholic army captured the bustling Protestant town and it was ransacked and looted. It slumbered for hundreds of years until it was rediscovered in the 19th century. But, as it turned out, its isolation throughout that period had kept it in a sort of time bubble, eventually re-emerging as one of Europe's most authentic and well-preserved medieval towns. Today, it's one of the key stops on the Romantic Road, a designated sightseeing route for all that might be considered quintessentially German. Some 2.5 million visitors flock to the town each year to take in one of Bavaria's most favoured settlements. Amongst the sights are the perfectly intact town walls. They connect 5 gated towers constructed from the 13th to the 16th centuries. Guided historic walking tours take visitors around the Gothic churches, exhibits and museums. And if that isn't enough to immerse you in the city's past, Rothenburg also offers a variety of medieval-themed festivals, concerts and plays. Flying south over Bavarian countryside, the sheer scale of farming gives away the fact that this state produces the most food in Germany. And more land than anywhere else in the world is given to growing hops. After all, it's an essential ingredient in Bavarian beer. Our next destination lies along an inland port on the River Main. Würzburg. It's a city steeped in history, the site of numerous revolts and invasions and the devastation during World War II, where nearly 90% was reduced to rubble. Many of the original buildings have been laboriously restored to their former glory, a fitting tribute to the resilience of the local people. Today, it remains the regional capital of Lower Franconia. Würzburg is a city of university students and industry. It's renowned for its art, architecture and wine. The great 20th century German author Hermann Hesse once said, "If I could choose my place of birth, I would consider Würzburg." To the east is a real pearl of the city, a castle to beat all castles, simply called the Residence. This magnificent Baroque palace is one of the largest in Germany and deemed by Napoleon to be the loveliest parsonage in Europe. Once home of the Prince Bishops of Würzburg, this 400-room masterpiece is said to be rivaled only by Versailles near Paris. In 1780, construction was coordinated by the young architect Balthasar Neumann, who worked with a talented pool of craftsmen from all across Europe. The bishop who commissioned the residence wanted a proper palace, rather than the drafty old fortress of his predecessors. It seems his wish was granted. And towering over the city is that very drafty old place that served the Prince Bishops 5 centuries prior to the building of the residence, Marienburg Castle. What it may have lacked in comfort was made up for as the undisputed symbol of Würzburg. The oldest building within the fortress walls dates back to the 8th century. But beginning in the 1200s and continuing throughout the Renaissance and Baroque periods, fortifications were continually added. Its first test of strength took place during the Peasants' Revolt of the 16th century, when an army of 15,000 peasants were unable to breach the outer walls. As a result, they were soon outflanked by Swabian forces, and half were massacred in the battle that ensued. Today, it's an altogether more peaceful place, and the Fürstenbau Museum in the Prince's Wing of the fortress allows visitors to walk through 1,200 years of Würzburg history. But one thing that hasn't changed over the march of time is the German love for the outdoors. On hot summer days, most locals choose to cool off at the community pool. Some 400 of these facilities are dotted around Germany, offering the opportunity to swim and bathe beneath the open sky. Such scenes have been prevalent throughout the country since the 18th century. But Germany's love affair with swimming goes back even further. In 1539, the world's first swimming manual was written by German languages professor Nikolaus Windman. In doing so, he hoped to reduce the dangers of drowning whilst swimming. But even if you haven't read the professor's book, we all know it's safest to swim accompanied. Judging by the numbers here, there's nothing to worry about today. Traditionally, the community pools are built alongside the waterways. In this instance, the River Main. It winds its way for 574 kilometers from Mainz to Bamberg and has played a vital role in trade and fishing in the 3 states it serves. The Main River is seen as a dividing line between northern and southern Germany. Leisure cruises offer fascinating trips through these historic heartlands. Off the beaten path, but not far from the river, is Weizschockheim Castle, built in the 18th century for the Prince Bishops of Würzburg. Perhaps more famous than the castle itself are the lavish gardens, containing a man-made lake and fountain as a centerpiece. They were designed according to the principles of the French Rococo style. It's one of few such examples in all of Germany. The grounds were restored to their former glory in the 1950s. They're now looked after by the Bavarian State College for Wines and Gardens, which was founded on this site in 1902 as the Royal School of Gardening and Wine Culture. Heading east, we pass the 17th century Farbruck Sanctuary. It's cared for by Augustinian monks and is a popular site of pilgrimage. Rejoining the River Main takes us to Bamberg, the last stop on our journey. Here on the outskirts is the city's inland harbour, an industrial and commercial centre for textiles, electrical equipment and heavy machinery. The docks have long been vital to the region, since it's part of a waterway system that connects the Black Sea to the North Sea. Beyond the harbour is the historic town of Bamberg itself. Pretty as a picture postcard, having been left relatively unscathed by Germany's tumultuous past. It's maintained at least one good example of every European architectural style from the Romanesque onward, without losing its medieval charm. The meandering river, lined with old half-timbered houses, harkens back to a simpler time when Bamberg was a small independent state ruled by an elected prince-bishop. A short walk through orchards leads to Michaelsburg Abbey, now a retirement community. Its Baroque church is dedicated to St. Michael. The building was damaged by an earthquake and fire in earlier times, but was fully restored and is still in use for worship today. And finally, we come to the city's beloved landmark and UNESCO World Heritage Site, Bamberg Cathedral. With its 4 towers dominating the skyline, it's an exquisite monument to late Romanesque and early Gothic architecture. A splendid place to end this journey.